welcome. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Or, I might show up at your door. I'm just here to share some creepy stories, so sit back and enjoy. Disclaimer: the content presented in the video is purely for entertainment purposes only. The theories and stories discussed in this video are speculative and are not supported by any evidence or proof. Viewer discretion is advised. I'm used to small tremors in this part of the country. Earthquakes are rare, but they happen, usually brief, sometimes unsettling, but never anything to be concerned about. We're at the edge of a fault line, but it's one of those things you don't really think about until it's happening. But today felt different. Started slow. A low hum at first, like something distant, barely noticeable. I was sitting at my kitchen table, coffee mug in hand, when it hit. A subtle shift beneath my feet, a lurch that made the walls creak. It wasn't violent, not at first. I'd felt these little shakes before, so I figured it was just another passing tremor, nothing to worry about. But then it happened again, stronger this time. The chair I was sitting in rocked back slightly, and the light above me swayed. This wasn't right. I stood up and grabbed the doorframe to steady myself, heart already pounding. Another rumble. This one was deeper, more ominous. The floor beneath my feet seemed to ripple, almost like it was breathing. I had no idea what I was feeling, but I knew it was different. I grabbed my phone off the counter, checking the news, but there was nothing. No breaking stories, no reports of an earthquake. I ran to the window and looked outside, half expecting to see the entire street shaking, but nothing. The trees were still. The cars parked in driveways were unmoving, but the ground felt wrong, like it was pressing up from below. Then the sirens started. Not the usual emergency sirens that test every week. These were different. The sound was sharp, persistent, and chilling. It was the kind of sound you only hear in the movies, the kind that signals something is coming, something bad. I felt a cold sweat form on my back. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel it in my bones. Something was wrong. I wasn't the only one out there. People were already gathering in the street, some looking up at the sky, others staring at the ground beneath their feet like they were waiting for it to open up and swallow them whole. I wasn't sure what I expected, but I was hoping for answers, or at least some explanation. A few of the neighbors stood together, whispering, eyes darting nervously between each other. No one had any real answers. Some of them had heard a deep rumble earlier, others hadn't felt anything at all. No one knew what was happening, but the air had shifted. Something was coming. Something was changing. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Across the street, Mr. Harris from the gas station stood on his porch, his old dog at his feet, staring down at the ground as if it might open up and swallow him at any moment. He'd lived here longer than anyone I knew, but today he didn't look calm. The emergency alert system crackled to life just then, piercing through the quiet. Attention, citizens of Pine Ridge. This is an emergency message from the National Alert System. It was a man's voice, calm, yet too calm, like he had no idea what was happening, but he had to say something. His voice seemed to come from nowhere, bouncing off the houses, echoing in the stillness of the morning. There have been reports of unusual ground movements in your area. This is not a test. Please remain indoors and await further instructions. Do not attempt to leave your homes. Emergency services are responding to the situation. Repeat, do not leave your homes. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about the way he said it, the coldness, the formality, made it clear this wasn't just a minor tremor. It wasn't just another earthquake warning. It was as if the earth itself had decided to move in a way no one had ever anticipated. And I didn't know why, but I felt like something was stirring beneath us, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I glanced around at the others on the street. No one moved. No one knew what to do. Mr. Harris had his hand on his dog's collar, as if ready to pull it inside, but he didn't move. The sky was still gray, no sign of storm clouds. The air felt heavier than before. Then, a loud cracking sound echoed through the street. I whipped my head around just in time to see the sidewalk split. A deep crack appeared in the concrete, wide enough to swallow a car tire. It wasn't like a typical earthquake crack. No, this was something different. The earth was pulling apart as if it were alive. And then it happened again. The ground trembled beneath us. Stronger this time. The ground itself was shifting, stretching, as if some unseen force was pulling it apart from below. The crack in the street deepened, spreading in every direction, like veins of a living thing. People gasped, retreating back to their houses, but I stood frozen, watching. Couldn't look away. The sirens blared louder now, the emergency message repeating. But it didn't seem to matter anymore. The world had already shifted, and there was no going back. I turned to run back inside, but I hesitated. Something deep in my gut told me to wait, to listen. I could hear it now, a faint rumbling sound from below. Not the usual tremor. This wasn't the earth shifting because of some tectonic plate moving. It was something more. Something alive. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, feeling the weight of what was happening bear down on me. I ran to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer out. I watched in disbelief as a car, parked across the street, seemed to sink into the ground. Slowly at first, then faster, as if the earth itself were swallowing it whole. That was when I realized the ground wasn't just shifting. It wasn't just moving. It was alive, and it was coming for us. The ground kept shaking. The cracks spread further, winding through the streets like dark veins. I couldn't stop looking at them, the way they split the pavement open, widening with each tremor. Each rumble, each shift of the earth beneath my feet, felt like a warning, a reminder that the world I knew wasn't the same anymore. I didn't leave the house immediately. I don't know why. Fear, maybe. A strange sense of waiting. I guess I was hoping it would pass, that everything would just stop. But it didn't. The shaking grew stronger, more persistent. The sirens never stopped blaring. The emergency alerts continued to broadcast, but their words felt less and less reassuring as time went on. Attention, citizens of Pine Ridge. Remain indoors. Do not attempt to leave. Emergency services are responding to the situation. That was all they said. No explanation. Just stay put, don't leave, wait. What were we waiting for? What were we supposed to do? I paced through the house, the walls still vibrating with every tremor. My mind raced with questions, each one more frantic than the last. What caused this? Why here? Why now? My phone buzzed, cutting through the silence. It was a text from Jamie, a friend I hadn't heard from in a while. You feel it? What the hell's going on? I didn't know how to answer. I had no idea what was going on. I still didn't, but I couldn't ignore the unease in Jamie's message. It was the same thing everyone was feeling. Something wasn't right, and none of us had the answers. I quickly typed back a reply, but before I could hit send, there was another rumble, this one harder than the others. The whole house shook, a deep, resonating thud that felt like the earth itself was breathing. I dropped my phone in a panic, grabbing the nearest thing to steady myself, my kitchen counter. The tremors made it hard to stay balanced, and the floor felt as if it were shifting beneath me. There was a scream outside. A woman's voice panicked. I ran to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see what was happening. A group of people were running down the street, looking over their shoulders, their faces twisted in fear. The ground was cracking wide open in front of them, faster than I'd ever seen before. It wasn't like any earthquake I'd heard about. This wasn't the slow, steady roll of the earth moving under pressure. No, this was something violent, something that seemed to come from deep within the earth, forcing its way up to the surface. I watched as one of the men in the group stumbled, falling to the ground as the earth shifted again, the ground beneath him swallowing him whole. He didn't scream. There was no time. One moment he was running, and the next, he was gone, vanished into the earth like a stone dropped into a river. The others froze, staring at the spot where he'd disappeared. Some of them were still trying to run, but it was clear they weren't going to make it. I heard another rumble. It was louder this time, and then I saw it. A massive crack opened up across the street, wider than anything I'd ever seen. It swallowed a car whole, the vehicle disappearing into the earth as if it had never existed. The ground wasn't just shaking anymore. It was shifting, opening up like a mouth. I backed away from the window, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. What the hell was going on? There was another message on my phone from Jamie. "Where are you? You good?" I didn't know how to respond. How could I tell her that the ground was literally tearing itself apart outside my window? How could I explain what I'd just seen, the way the earth seemed to move with a mind of its own? I looked at the phone again, staring at the message. I wanted to text back, to tell her everything, but I couldn't form the words. The sirens kept blaring outside, and the emergency messages repeated endlessly. "Do not attempt to leave your homes. Remain indoors. Emergency services are responding." Felt like a joke, a cruel joke. Emergency services? Who was coming? The whole town was shaking, and no one had answers. There was no one to help us. I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door, determined to get to Jamie's house. I wasn't going to stay in here waiting for something I didn't understand. Whatever was happening, it wasn't safe to stay inside anymore. The street outside was chaos. People were running in all directions, shouting to each other, trying to find shelter. Some were heading toward their cars, but the roads were already too dangerous. The cracks in the pavement were deepening, spreading farther into the town. Cars were abandoning their parked spots, rolling slowly down the street toward the ever-growing cracks. I made my way to Jamie's, moving quickly but cautiously, dodging fallen debris and trying not to step too close to the growing cracks in the ground. The buildings on either side of me seemed to tremble, their foundations buckling under the pressure. The streetlights flickered and dimmed, casting an eerie glow over everything. When I finally reached Jamie's house, I knocked frantically on the door, my heart pounding in my chest. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. My mind raced, panic rising in my throat. Had she already left? Had she? The door creaked open slightly, and I nearly collapsed in relief. It was Jamie, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "You're here," she said, almost whispering, as if she couldn't believe it either. "I didn't know where else to go," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't know what's happening. The ground, it's alive, Jamie. Something is moving under it." She stepped aside, letting me in, but I could see the fear in her eyes, the same look that had been on everyone's face outside. We didn't know what was happening, but we could both feel it. The ground, the earth itself, was shifting. Another rumble shook the house, and we both flinched, the sound of the earth groaning beneath us too loud to ignore. It wasn't going to stop. Whatever was happening, it was only getting worse. We stayed inside Jamie's house, huddled together in the living room, listening to the constant hum of sirens outside. The emergency broadcasts on the radio kept repeating the same thing. "Do not leave your homes. Remain indoors. Emergency services are responding." Felt more like a warning than an instruction now. There was no real sense of control in their voice, no certainty in their words. The air outside was heavy with tension, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was getting closer. I paced the room, trying to make sense of it all. The tremors hadn't stopped. Every few minutes, the floor would shake again, the walls would groan, and the house would feel like it was going to collapse into the earth beneath it. I could hear the crack of the ground splitting outside, the unmistakable sound of something breaking apart from below. It wasn't just an earthquake. It was something far worse. Jamie sat on the couch, staring at her phone, her fingers scrolling through news updates. Nothing that made any sense. People were posting their fears online, sharing videos of the cracks in the ground, but no one had an explanation. There were rumors of sinkholes opening up, entire buildings disappearing into the earth, but no one could confirm anything. It was like we were all caught in some kind of limbo, waiting for answers that never came. "I can't stay here much longer," Jamie said, her voice trembling. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with the same fear I had. "What if it gets worse? What if we're next?" "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The ground had already swallowed people whole. It had taken buildings, it had taken cars, and now it felt like it was waiting for something else. The sense of being hunted was overwhelming. "But we can't just leave. The whole town's shaking. The roads are impassable. The cracks, they're getting bigger." Jamie stood up, walking over to the window, peering through the blinds. "I don't care. I need to get out of here. This place feels wrong." I joined her at the window, and we both watched in silence as the street outside continued to crumble. The ground was pulling apart in places we hadn't seen before. The sidewalks were splitting open, and entire sections of pavement were sinking into the earth. I saw another car roll down the street, its tires screeching, before it disappeared into one of the widening cracks. "What's happening?" Jamie whispered, her voice full of disbelief. "I don't know," I replied, feeling a pit grow in my stomach. There were no answers, not for us, not for anyone. We were waiting just like everyone else, waiting for something to change, something to happen that would make it stop. But it didn't. The tremors kept coming, the earth kept shifting, and with every second, the world felt more and more like it was slipping away. A loud boom suddenly rattled the house, followed by a deafening crack. The windows trembled in their frames, and for a moment, everything went silent. We both froze, staring at each other. The air was thick with the sound of the earth groaning, the pressure building, and I couldn't take it anymore. "I need to get out there," I said, pulling away from the window. "I need to see what's going on." Jamie's hand shot out, grabbing my arm. "No, don't go out there. It's not safe. We don't know what's causing this. What if it's—" She trailed off, her voice breaking. I looked down at her hand on my arm, feeling the weight of her fear. She was right, I knew that. But I couldn't just sit here, waiting for the earth to swallow us whole. I needed to know what was happening. I needed to understand what we were dealing with. "I have to," I said, pulling away. "I'll be back, okay? I'll be careful." Jamie stared at me for a long moment, her eyes pleading, but in the end, she just nodded. She knew she couldn't stop me. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The moment I stepped outside, the ground shook again, harder this time. I could feel the vibrations in my feet, the way the earth seemed to shift under my weight. I took a deep breath and forced myself to walk toward the street. The air was thick with dust, and the once pristine suburban street was now a chaotic mess of rubble and debris. There was a strange smell in the air, like earth and something else, something metallic. I looked around, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but it was impossible. There was nothing normal about any of this. The cracks in the ground were deeper now, and more had appeared since the last time I looked. Some of the houses had begun to tilt, their foundations giving way to the shifting earth. It was like the ground itself was alive, and it was moving, reaching for anything it could claim. I stopped when I reached the corner, staring down the street. The damage was worse the farther you looked. Entire sections of the road had vanished, replaced by large, gaping holes. The earth had opened up like a wound, swallowing anything in its path. Then I saw it. A figure was standing in the middle of the street, just beyond the cracks. It was impossible to make out any details, but it looked like a person or something that used to be a person. I couldn't tell if they were moving or if they were frozen in place, but they were there, right in the middle of the destruction. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I should have turned back, should have gone inside. But something about that figure, something about the stillness of it, pulled me closer. I took a step forward, my feet heavy on the ground. The earth trembled again, but I ignored it. This was different. I had to know what that was. I took another step, And then the figure moved. It was a quick motion, a jerking movement, and I froze. The thing, whatever it was, wasn't human. Its limbs twisted unnaturally, bending in ways they shouldn't have. Its head snapped around in my direction, and I could feel its gaze, even from this distance. Cold, empty. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it disappeared back into the cracks, vanishing into the earth like a shadow. I stood there, my heart racing. My breath was shallow, and I didn't know what to think. Had I just seen a creature? Or was I losing my mind? I turned and ran back toward Jamie's house, not stopping until I was inside, slamming the door behind me. "You won't believe what I saw," I gasped, my hands shaking. Jamie stood up, her face pale, eyes wide. "What happened? What did you see?" I don't know," I stammered. "There was something out there. Person, no, not a person. It wasn't human." She stepped back, fear creeping across her face. "What do you mean? What was it?" "I don't know," I repeated, my mind racing. "But it's out there, and it's coming." The night came quickly. The ground never stopped shaking, the tremors relentless, as though the earth was fighting against itself. The streets were dark except for the flickering streetlights, casting an eerie glow on the wreckage. The sound of sirens blended into the background, a constant hum of chaos and fear. But amidst the noise, something felt off. There was a deep silence, a stillness in the air that made every breath feel heavier. I sat in the living room of Jamie's house, my thoughts spinning. The thing I saw, whatever it was, kept replaying in my mind. I didn't want to believe it, couldn't, but I knew what I had seen. Its eyes, cold and empty, watching me as if it knew I was going to approach, as if it had been waiting for me. Jamie sat across from me, her phone still in her hand, though I could tell she wasn't really looking at it anymore. Her eyes were fixed on me, waiting for answers that I didn't have. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Every time I opened my mouth, my mind would seize up, my thoughts too jumbled to make any sense. "I don't know what it was, Jamie," I finally managed, my voice hoarse. "It was like a person, but not. It was wrong." Jamie's gaze flickered to the window, where the darkness pressed in from outside. The faint sound of something moving in the distance caught our attention. A low, rumbling noise, like the earth was groaning beneath us. "What if it's the thing causing all this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if that's what's making the ground do this?" I didn't know how to answer her. How could I? The earth itself was changing. I'd seen it firsthand, the cracks in the ground, the way the earth shifted like it was alive. The things that had appeared, the creatures or whatever they were somehow connected to it. I was sure of that, but I didn't know how or why. The radio in the corner crackled to life, breaking the silence. We both turned toward it, the emergency alert system blaring in the background. "Attention, citizens of Pine Ridge. Remain indoors. Do not attempt to leave. Emergency services are responding to the situation." I had heard this message over and over. Each time it sounded more desperate, more empty. They were responding to what? How could anyone respond to something like this? I stood up, pacing the room again. "It's not just the ground, Jamie. Something else. I can feel it." Jamie didn't answer me. She was staring at the window, her eyes wide, lips trembling. I followed her gaze, trying to make sense of whatever was making her react like this. The sky was darkening, the last remnants of daylight slipping away. But it wasn't the sky that caught my attention. It was the ground. I saw movement, a ripple in the earth. At first, I thought it was another tremor, another crack forming. But this was different. The ground, it was shifting, moving, as if something was crawling underneath it. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I could see it more clearly now. Something was pushing through the earth. The ground was bulging in places, like the earth itself was stretching, like it was being pulled in all directions. It looked alive. "Do you see that?" I whispered, my voice shaky. Jamie nodded, her face pale. "What is it?" "I don't know," I said, my mind racing. But it's not normal. We both watched in silence, unable to look away as the ground continued to shift. The earth seemed to be alive with a kind of malevolent intent, pushing upward, cracking open like a wound. And then, from the darkness, came a sound, a low, guttural noise, something between a growl and a hum. It reverberated through the walls of the house, shaking the floor beneath us. Jamie gasped, her hand clutching mine. What is that? I don't know, I said again, my heart pounding in my chest. But this time, I could feel the weight of the truth bearing down on me. Something was coming, something that had been waiting, and now it was rising to the surface. There was another rumble, but this one was different. It wasn't the usual tremor from the shifting earth. No, this one felt like a warning. The walls shook, the windows rattled in their frames. And then, without any further warning, the ground exploded. I barely had time to react before the entire house shook violently. A deafening crack split the air as the earth split open in front of us, the ground heaving upward like something was clawing its way out of the depths. I stumbled back, nearly losing my balance as the floor tilted. Dust and debris filled the air, the noise of the earth tearing itself apart too loud to ignore. Jamie screamed, her hands gripping the back of the couch as the walls groaned, buckling under the pressure. I felt the air shift around me, thick with the smell of dirt and something else, something foul, like decay. I couldn't see what was happening outside, but I could hear it, the sound of the earth breaking, of something large moving beneath the surface. Something huge, something with purpose. I grabbed Jamie's arm, pulling her away from the window. We had to move. We had to get out before it was too late. Come on, I shouted, dragging her toward the door. But before I could open it, another rumble split the air. The entire house shuddered, and the doorframe cracked. We can't stay here, Jamie said, her voice trembling. We need to get out of town now. I nodded, feeling the weight of the urgency in her words. There was no time to waste. We had to leave before whatever was coming found us. But as I opened the door, ready to escape into the chaos outside, something caught my eye. A figure was standing in the street. At first, I thought it was another person, another survivor. But as I looked closer, I realized something was wrong. The figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, its body unnaturally rigid. And as I looked deeper, I saw the same dark, empty eyes I had seen before. It was one of them. My breath caught in my throat as the figure slowly turned its head toward me. For a moment, we just stared at each other. And in that moment, I knew this thing wasn't human. And it wasn't alone. The ground around it shifted, and I could hear the earth groaning again, pulling itself open. The thing began to move, its limbs twisting unnaturally as it walked toward me. Run! Jamie screamed. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed her hand and pulled her out the door, slamming it shut behind us as we ran into the chaos outside. But I knew, deep down, that we weren't going to escape. Not from this, not from what was rising from the ground. We ran without looking back, my heart pounding in my chest, each step feeling heavier than the last. The ground beneath our feet was uneven, cracking and groaning as if it were alive. The very earth was fighting against us, pushing back in ways I couldn't comprehend. I could hear the low hum of something underground, something deep and resonant, almost like a heartbeat. It made my skin crawl, the sound vibrating through the soles of my shoes, shaking my bones. I dragged Jamie down the street, her breath ragged, her hand tight around mine. Her eyes kept darting to the shadows, the movement in the darkness just beyond the streetlights. But I couldn't let myself look. I couldn't let myself stop. Not when the things I'd seen outside were closing in, their presence growing like a storm on the horizon. We have to keep going, I said through gritted teeth. Though I didn't know if I was talking to her or to myself, we passed what had once been a neighbor's house. Now the structure was half collapsed, a gaping hole in the middle of the yard where a sinkhole had swallowed it whole. The ground around it was still shifting, slowly pulling the house deeper into the earth. I didn't know if anyone had been inside, but I didn't want to know. The terror in my gut was enough. Where are we going? Jamie's voice broke through my thoughts. We need to find somewhere safe. I hesitated, looking around at the destruction surrounding us. Every building seemed ready to cave in, every inch of pavement broken into jagged shards. The sky was darkening quickly, the pale light of the street lamps casting long shadows over the cracked earth. There was no safety here, not anywhere close. The ground itself had turned against us. We just need to keep moving. We need to get out of the center of town, I muttered, hoping it sounded more convincing than I felt. But deep down, I knew there was nowhere we could go where the ground wouldn't pull us under. Suddenly, the ground beneath us gave a violent lurch, and we both stumbled, barely keeping our balance. The tremors were becoming more frequent, more intense. The air felt thicker with every breath, as if the world were tightening around us. What the hell is happening? Jamie gasped, her eyes wide with fear. This can't be normal. I don't know, I said, my voice trembling. But it's not an earthquake. This is something else. Something worse. We kept running, but it was getting harder to ignore the strange, guttural noises coming from the ground beneath us. The earth was groaning, shifting, as if something large was moving underneath it. It was impossible to pinpoint where the sound was coming from, but it was everywhere, surrounding us. Then, through the darkness, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The silhouette of a figure, a person or something that resembled a person, standing at the edge of the street, just beyond the reach of the streetlights. Its body was unnaturally still, but the way it stood, rigid and upright, made my skin crawl. Do you see that? Jamie whispered, her voice barely audible over the tremors. I nodded, my throat tight. I see it. The figure didn't move at first, just stood there, its head tilting ever so slightly toward us. I could feel its gaze, though I couldn't make out any details in the darkness. But the air felt colder, and I knew that whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. The ground shifted again, but this time, the sound came from beneath us. The earth cracked, opening wide, and I heard something slithering, writhing, below. My stomach churned at the sound. It was too much. I couldn't take it anymore. Run! I shouted, pulling Jamie along with me. We sprinted, the sound of our footsteps drowned out by the rumbling of the earth. The distant figures, those things standing in the shadows, were multiplying. I could see them now, standing at every corner, at every broken intersection, their movements stiff and unnatural. Their eyes, dark, hollow, and dead, watched us as we ran, but they didn't move. Not yet. They're following us, Jamie gasped, looking back, her voice trembling. I know, I said, my chest tightening. The terror was suffocating, but I didn't dare stop. If we stopped, if we let them catch up, there would be no escape. We turned a corner, desperate to find some kind of refuge, but the street ahead was just as bad. The houses were either in ruins or tilting precariously over the open gaps in the earth. The ground was buckling, and I could hear the horrible, sharp noises of things breaking and shifting beneath the surface. The deeper the cracks, the closer we were to whatever lurked beneath. Where do we go? Jamie cried, almost hysterical. We're trapped. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what was happening, only that we had to keep moving, keep fighting for some semblance of safety. But where was the safety? The creatures were everywhere, their hollow eyes trained on us, their bodies twitching, ready to lurch forward. Then a sound broke through. A voice. Stop! We froze, every muscle in my body locking up. I turned slowly toward the source of the voice, heart hammering in my chest. At the end of the street stood a figure, someone human. Someone who had to be human. A man, dressed in dark military fatigues, his face covered by a helmet. Behind him, the shadows seemed to grow thicker, the air around him heavier. He raised his hand, signaling for us to stop. You need to come with me, he ordered, his voice commanding, firm. I didn't hesitate. I didn't know who this person was, but the way the ground was splitting and those things were watching us, there was no time to question anything. Please, Jamie gasped. We can't stay here. They're everywhere. The man nodded, stepping forward. I know, but you're not safe out here. None of us are. He motioned for us to follow him, and without another word, we did. He led us through the broken streets, and I could hear the others. The things, watching us from the shadows, their eyes glinting in the dark. I didn't know what they were, but I had a terrible feeling they were waiting for something. We're not going to make it, are we? Jamie asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. I didn't know how to. We were already running on borrowed time, and whatever was happening was far beyond our control. The man stopped abruptly, turning to face us. Get inside, he ordered. We obeyed, stepping into a nearby building, a once sturdy suburban home that now stood on the edge of collapse. The windows were cracked, and the floors creaked with every movement. But at least it was shelter. We're safe for now, the man said, but his words were hollow. There was no real certainty in his voice, only the quiet resignation that seemed to hang in the air. But we need to prepare. Prepare for what? I asked, my voice raw. What's happening to us? The man didn't respond at first. He just looked at me, through me, his eyes tired, but determined. The ground isn't safe, and whatever's coming, it's only just begun. The air inside the house was thick with tension. The man, who had introduced himself as Sergeant Keller, paced the room, his boots clicking softly against the wooden floor. His helmet gleamed faintly in the low light, casting a cold sheen across his face, and his eyes darted back and forth, scanning the room as though there was something lurking just out of view. I watched him, my mind still reeling from everything that had happened in the last few hours. The constant tremors, the unnatural figures in the shadows, and the ground, God, the ground. It had started to feel like it was alive, like it had a mind of its own. There was no rational explanation for it, no science to make sense of it. It was all a nightmare, an absurd, terrifying nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. Jamie sat across from me, her hands clasped tightly together, her face pale and drawn. She hadn't said a word since we came inside, too frightened to speak, too stunned by the horrors we'd witnessed. I didn't know what to say either. Words seemed meaningless in the face of what was happening around us. Keller stopped pacing, his gaze flicking to the window. I'm not sure how much time we have, he muttered, more to himself than to us. His voice was rough, but there was an underlying urgency in it that made my stomach twist. Time for what? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Keller turned toward me, his eyes sharp, his face hard. For everything to go to hell, he said bluntly. The ground, what's happening with it, is just the beginning. Whatever's causing this isn't just pulling things down. It's bringing something up. I felt a chill run down my spine. What do you mean, bringing something up? He paused, his lips pressed into a thin line. The creatures, the things we've been seeing, they're not just random. They're not just people who got caught in the collapse. He took a deep breath, his expression darkening. They're hollow. I blinked. Hollow, empty, he clarified, his voice quiet now. It's as if their insides are gone. They're not human anymore. They're just shells, animated by whatever is beneath the ground. The thing that's pulling everything in, pulling them up. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. So, they're not alive? My words were shaky, but I had to ask. Keller nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. Not in the way you or I are. They're vessels, puppets. Whatever's under the earth is using them. And I don't know how, but it's feeding off of them, using their bodies to crawl its way back to the surface. I sat back, the weight of his words pressing on my chest. The creatures we'd seen, those things watching from the shadows, standing still and stiff like statues, hadn't just been random horrors. They were part of something much worse. And they weren't the only ones. There were more, I was sure of it. We'd only seen the beginning. What's underneath us? Jamie whispered, her voice barely audible. "What's doing this?" Keller didn't answer immediately. He just stared out the window, his eyes distant. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but I think it's been there for a long time. Longer than any of us could imagine." I glanced over at Jamie, and I could see the fear reflected in her eyes, the same fear I felt. The fear of the unknown, of the thing beneath us that was pulling everything down into its depths. I felt like we were all just waiting for the moment when it would finally rise up and swallow us whole. "We need to get out of here," I said, the words tumbling out of my mouth before I could think. "We need to find somewhere safe." Keller shook his head slowly. "There's no safe place. Not anymore. The whole town's already sinking. It's spreading. The earth, it's unstable everywhere." I felt a pang of hopelessness stab through me. "Then what do we do?" He looked at us, his face grim. "We survive. For as long as we can." The sound of movement outside broke the silence. A scraping noise like something dragging across the pavement. Keller's hand went to the rifle slung across his chest, his posture stiffening. He motioned for us to stay quiet, his eyes scanning the street outside through the cracked blinds. "Get down," he ordered in a low voice. We obeyed without hesitation, crouching down as quietly as we could. I could hear the thudding of my heart in my ears, the tension in the air almost palpable. There was something out there, something that had heard us or maybe sensed us. It was impossible to tell what it was, but it was close. Another scraping noise came, louder this time, closer. The sound of something dragging itself along the ground, like bones scraping over concrete. Then there was a low groan, and I could hear the distinct thud of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, but with a strange, uneven rhythm. The thing was moving. My hand went instinctively to the door, my fingers brushing the handle. But before I could make a move, Keller shot me a sharp glance. "Don't even think about it," he whispered harshly. "Stay down. It's not human." The scraping continued, then stopped. Dead silence. I held my breath, my chest tight, waiting for the next sound. The air was so still, so unnaturally still. Even the tremors of the ground had subsided for a brief moment, leaving only an unsettling quiet. And then, finally, a shadow passed across the window. It wasn't the kind of shadow a human would cast. It was elongated, distorted, as though something long and unnatural was looming just outside. The scraping resumed, dragging itself along the pavement again. It was getting closer. I could hear its breathing now, a wet, ragged sound. "Stay quiet," Keller mouthed, his face tense. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but I couldn't. The very idea of drawing attention to ourselves made my blood run cold. Outside, the creature, or whatever it was, seemed to hesitate. I could feel its presence pressing against the walls, a slow, deliberate approach. It was like it was toying with us, taking its time to savor the fear it was causing. And then, without warning, it moved away. I exhaled sharply, almost choking on the air in my lungs. But Keller didn't relax. He stayed on alert, his eyes never leaving the window. After a long moment, he turned to us. "We can't stay here. Not anymore." Jamie's voice cracked. "What if it comes back? Then we'll be ready," Keller said, his voice low but determined. "But right now, we need to move." I didn't know what else to say. There was no place to hide, no place to run. Whatever was underground, whatever was causing this chaos, it was closing in on us. And we were running out of time. We didn't have time to question Keller's orders. His face, as cold and unyielding as the earth beneath our feet, told me everything I needed to know. There was no safe place, no hiding from the terror that was crawling its way to the surface. Whatever had awakened beneath our feet was far more dangerous than we had realized. Keller led the way out of the house, and we followed as quietly as we could, our footsteps muffled by the thick dust that had settled over the ground. The tremors had lessened for the moment, but I could feel it in my bones. Something was coming. The earth was restless, waiting for the right moment to strike again. We moved through the streets in silence, the weight of our situation pressing down on us with every step. The neighborhood was eerily still, too still. The homes we passed were empty shells, windows shattered, doors ajar, their insides abandoned in haste. The air was thick with dust, the scent of decay creeping through the cracks in the walls. The world felt hollow, as if it had been drained of life. Jamie walked beside me, her hand gripping mine tightly. I could feel her trembling, her body pressed close to mine as if seeking some kind of comfort. But I couldn't offer her any. I was just as scared, just as unsure of what was happening around us. The ground beneath us had already begun to devour the town, and there was no escaping it. No matter how far we ran, no matter how hard we tried to hide, the earth was closing in on us. Keller stopped abruptly, his hand raised in a silent signal for us to halt. I could see it in his eyes. He was listening, straining to hear something beyond the hum of the distant tremors. I held my breath, waiting for him to speak. "There," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. He pointed to the ground ahead of us. I squinted into the dim light, but I didn't see anything at first. The street seemed deserted, the pavement cracked but otherwise undisturbed. But then I noticed it, the faintest shift in the earth. A ripple like something moving just beneath the surface. My heart stopped. The ground wasn't just shifting anymore. It was splitting. A deep, jagged crack had appeared in the pavement, and it was growing wider with every passing second. The sound of it was sickening, like bones breaking, the earth itself groaning under some invisible weight. The crack widened until I could see the darkness beneath, a yawning chasm that seemed to stretch down into the very core of the earth. "Move!" Keller hissed, grabbing my arm and pulling me away from the edge. We stumbled backward, my legs nearly giving out beneath me as I tried to regain my balance. The ground trembled again, harder this time, and I could hear something deep, something ancient, growling beneath the earth. It wasn't a sound that should belong to this world. "Where are we going?" Jamie cried, her voice tight with fear. Keller didn't answer. He just continued pulling us away from the chasm, guiding us through the shattered streets, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The ground was still shaking, and I could feel it getting worse. The city was slowly sinking, pieces of it collapsing into the abyss, and we were running out of time. The distant figures were still there, watching from the shadows. I could feel their eyes on us, even though I didn't dare look. There was something about the way they moved, or rather didn't move, that made my skin crawl. They were just standing there, waiting, silent, empty husks of whatever they had once been. Keller didn't stop. He pushed forward, his pace quickening. But as we rounded a corner, I saw it. Another crack, this one even wider, and it stretched all the way across the road. The pavement was splitting like a giant's mouth, and the darkness below seemed to be reaching upward, pulling at the edges of the broken ground. "We can't keep running," I said, my voice breaking. "We're just running into more of this." Keller's expression hardened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out a map, unfolding it quickly. He scanned it with a sharp gaze, his finger tracing along the lines of the streets. "We need to get to the military outpost," he said, his voice low but urgent. "There's a chance, just a small one, that we'll find help there." "The outpost," I repeated, trying to process what he was saying. "You mean the one outside the city? But how are we supposed to get there? The roads are all destroyed." "We'll make it," Keller said firmly. "We don't have a choice." I didn't argue. At this point, I wasn't sure what else to do. We couldn't stay here. There was nothing left to stay for. But as we started moving again, I realized something that sent a chill crawling up my spine. The creatures, the hollow ones, they weren't just watching us. They were following us. I could feel them, their presence lurking at the edges of my vision, always just out of reach. The way they stood so still, so unnatural, but always present. I couldn't help but wonder if they were getting closer, if they were drawing nearer with every step we took. "Are we being followed?" Jamie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Keller didn't respond immediately. He was too focused on the path ahead. But after a moment, he spoke. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. "We are. But we can't stop. Not now." The ground cracked again, and I stumbled, nearly losing my balance. But it wasn't just the earth beneath us shifting. It was something else, something far more disturbing. I could hear it now, that low, guttural sound, the rumbling growl that seemed to be coming from deep within the earth. It wasn't just the hollow ones that were moving anymore. The ground itself was alive, and whatever was awakening beneath us, whatever had been sleeping for so long, was coming. "Keep moving," Keller urged, his voice tense with urgency. We didn't need to be told twice, but as we pressed on, I felt the weight of the earth beneath us shifting again. The air was thick with something foul, something that made my skin crawl. The creatures were getting closer, their hollow eyes locked on us, and I could hear their whispers in the dark, barely audible but chilling nonetheless. The ground beneath us groaned, and I heard a distant crash, the sound of buildings crumbling, of the city itself being consumed. And then I felt it. The earth was moving faster now. The chasm ahead was widening, swallowing everything in its path. The ground beneath us was no longer stable. The pavement buckled, split open, and I could see the darkness below, stretching deeper than I could comprehend. We had to keep moving. But in that moment, I realized there was no running from this. The ground wasn't safe, and it never had been. The world had grown quiet, eerily quiet. Even the rumbling tremors beneath the earth had subsided, leaving only an unnatural stillness in their wake. The air hung thick, oppressive, and the weight of the silence pressed down on us like a suffocating force. The crack in the earth was still there, stretching far across the road, a jagged wound in the ground that seemed to go on forever. But something had changed. The creatures, the hollow ones, were no longer lurking in the shadows. The streets, once teeming with unnatural figures, were now empty. Too empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Something more sinister than the hollow ones. Something even darker, lurking just beyond our reach. I glanced at Jamie, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She clung to my side, her breath shallow and rapid. "They're gone," she whispered, her voice trembling. Keller didn't respond, but I could see the unease in his eyes. He had always been the calm one, the one who could think clearly even in the face of danger. But now, as we stood in the midst of a shattered town, I could tell that even he was beginning to doubt everything we thought we knew. The silence stretched on, oppressive and heavy. No distant cries, no scraping of bones against pavement. Just the hollow echo of emptiness. It was as though the entire world had fallen into some kind of limbo, suspended between life and death. We kept moving, though every step felt like it was drawing us closer to the inevitable. Keller led the way, his rifle held steady in his hands, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. He didn't trust the silence, and neither did I. "We're almost there," Keller muttered, his voice tight with tension. "Just a little farther." "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice low. "To the military outpost," he said, glancing back at us. "We need to make contact. We need to know what's happening, why the ground is doing this." I nodded, but the words felt hollow. It had all become too much to process. We had been running for hours, our feet taking us through streets that felt increasingly unreal, like a half-forgotten dream. The town, once familiar, was now a twisted version of itself. Buildings were crumbling, walls were cracked, and the ground itself seemed to be dissolving before our eyes. The whole place was a trap, slowly sinking into the darkness beneath it. I tried to focus on the task at hand, getting to the outpost, finding help, but my mind kept returning to the hollow ones. Those creatures we had seen earlier, standing so still and unnatural, their eyes empty, their bodies hollow shells of what they had once been. They had been watching us, waiting, but now they were gone. I couldn't decide if that was a relief or something worse. "Do you hear that?" Jamie's voice broke through my thoughts, sharp and panicked. I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. The air was too still, too silent. But there it was, faint but unmistakable. A soft, high-pitched whistling, like the wind howling through a distant canyon. It seemed to echo from below, as if the ground itself were breathing. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel it deep in my chest, like a pulse that wasn't my own. My body tensed, my mind racing. Keller's hand shot out, grabbing my arm and pulling me back into the shadow of a collapsed building. "Stay low," he hissed. We crouched in the debris, listening, waiting. The whistling sound grew louder, more rhythmic, as though it were coming closer. There was something almost hypnotic about it, like a call from the depths of the earth itself. And then I saw it. A figure appeared at the edge of the street, moving slowly, deliberately. It wasn't a human figure, not entirely. The shape was distorted, elongated, like something that didn't quite belong in this world. It was draped in shadows, its form shifting and rippling as though it were made of the very air around it. I held my breath, my eyes fixed on it. The creature didn't seem to notice us at first. It moved with a fluid, unnatural grace, its limbs stretching and contracting in a way that made my stomach churn. It was as though its body was constantly reshaping itself, its skin rippling and shifting with each step. The whistling sound was coming from it. The creature's mouth, or what might have once been its mouth, opened slightly, emitting a strange, whistling sound as it passed by. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. It wasn't the hollow ones. This was something different, something new. Keller's grip on my arm tightened, and I could feel his pulse racing beneath his gloves. "Stay down," he whispered again, his voice low but firm. "Don't make a sound." We remained motionless, barely daring to breathe as the creature passed by. The air felt thick, as though the very atmosphere was being suffocated by its presence. I couldn't take my eyes off it, couldn't look away. It was like a nightmare come to life, a thing that shouldn't exist. When it was finally out of sight, Keller let out a shaky breath. He didn't speak at first, but I could see the dread in his eyes, the fear that had been growing in him since we first left the house. He turned to us, his face hardening with resolve. "We need to move. Now." I didn't need to be told twice. We got up, and this time we moved quickly, no longer concerned with the quiet or the danger of being spotted. There was no time to waste. The thing we had just seen wasn't the only one out there. There would be more, and we didn't have the luxury of hiding anymore. As we made our way through the ruins of the town, the ground beneath our feet began to tremble once more violently than before. The earth groaned, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from far below. The very air around us seemed to pulse with it, a rhythm that matched the beat of my own heart. The chasm ahead was widening again, the cracks in the ground growing deeper and more jagged. The darkness beneath seemed to be swelling, rising, and I could feel it pulling at my insides, as though the very gravity of the earth was trying to consume me. "We're running out of time," Keller said, his voice strained. "We need to get to the outpost. Now." We pressed on, our pace quickening as the ground beneath us began to collapse in earnest. The rumble was deafening now, and the streets were buckling beneath our feet. Buildings, already weakened by the shifting earth, began to crumble, their foundations cracking and splintering like dry wood. But through it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The air felt heavy with it, as though the creatures, the things beneath the ground, were closing in on us. And we were running out of time, running out of places to hide. I didn't know how much longer we could keep going, how much longer the ground would hold. But there was only one thing I knew for sure. The earth wasn't just unsafe. It was alive. The tremors had become relentless. Each step we took felt as though the earth beneath us might split wide open at any moment. Keller kept us moving, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, but there was no relief. The military outpost, our only hope, was still miles away, and the ground was slowly devouring everything in its path. We'd seen entire streets collapse into the chasm, whole blocks vanishing beneath our feet, swallowed by the very earth that had once supported them. The darkness beneath us was deepening, spreading like ink spilled across a page, and we were just fragments on the edges of it. There was no safety left in the world. "Almost there," Keller muttered under his breath, though his voice was tight, strained. He didn't look like he believed his own words. I didn't believe them either. The military outpost had been one of the few places left untouched by the first tremors. At least that's what we had been told. But now, as we pushed through the wreckage of what had once been a thriving town, I wasn't sure the outpost was going to be any better. Whatever had started here, whatever was causing the ground to collapse, had spread far beyond the city limits. The earth itself seemed alive, aware, hungry, and it was only a matter of time before it reached the outpost too. Jamie was quiet beside me, her hand tight around mine, her face pale and drawn. Couldn't blame her. We were both barely holding it together. The sight of the destruction, the unrelenting cracks in the ground, the creatures that still haunted the edges of our vision, everything was too much. And yet we pressed on. Every few minutes, I could feel the ground shudder beneath us, and each time, my heart skipped a beat. But the rumbling didn't stop. It wasn't an aftershock or a brief tremor. It was the earth itself, groaning, shifting, as if something beneath it was waking up. "Do you hear that?" Jamie asked suddenly, her voice trembling. I listened, straining to hear over the deafening roar of the collapsing town. At first, I thought it was just the rumble of the earth, but then I heard it, the low, grating noise like something scraping against stone. Something far too large to be human. Something ancient. Keller turned sharply, his weapon raised, eyes scanning the darkness. "Keep moving," he said, his voice low but urgent. We didn't need to be told twice. We pushed on, our feet crunching over debris, the air growing thicker with each passing minute. The scraping noise seemed to follow us, faint but persistent, always just out of reach. I couldn't tell if it was the creatures or something worse, something far older than we could possibly understand. But the fact that we could hear it and feel it meant that whatever was out there was getting closer. The buildings around us were skeletal, crumbling into dust with each new tremor. A distant cry, high-pitched and inhuman, echoed through the air, and I felt my stomach lurch. It wasn't the hollow ones. This was something different, something more aggressive. "There's something ahead," Keller said suddenly, halting in his tracks. I blinked, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. A small structure stood before us, half hidden behind the wreckage of a collapsed building. It looked like a guard post, but it was hard to tell. The exterior was scarred by the same cracks that had torn through the town, the walls buckling in on themselves as though the very foundation had been eaten away. "That's it," Keller said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The outpost." I felt a strange mix of hope and dread. We had made it if this was the outpost, but something about it felt off. The air around it was thick, heavy, like it was tainted with something foul. Something was wrong. I could feel it crawling beneath my skin, an instinct that told me not to get any closer. Keller didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his boots crunching against the shattered ground, his rifle raised, scanning every inch of the surroundings. Jamie and I followed, our pace slow, wary. "Where's the rest of the crew?" I asked, my voice tight with anxiety. "There should be more people here, right? Where are they?" Keller didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved forward, reaching for the door of the outpost. It was partially ajar, and a thick, acrid smell wafted out. Stale, like something had been rotting inside for far too long. "Stay behind me," Keller ordered, his voice low but firm. We didn't argue. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched as he stepped inside. I followed close behind, my heart pounding in my chest, my senses on high alert. The building was dimly lit by the flickering light of a few weak bulbs, the air stale and stagnant. It looked like no one had been here for days, maybe longer. The walls were lined with maps, communications equipment, and a few scattered personal items. But there were no soldiers, no sign of anyone. Just emptiness. The kind of emptiness that made your skin crawl. What the hell happened here? Jamie muttered under her breath. Keller didn't answer. He moved further into the room, his eyes scanning every corner. I could see his hand shaking slightly as he reached for a radio on the desk, turning the dials with quick, practiced movements. "We need to contact command," he said. "See if they have any updates on what's going on." The radio crackled, static hissing from the speakers. Keller cursed under his breath, adjusting the settings again. "Come on, come on." There was a sudden, sharp sound from behind us, the scraping noise again, louder now. It was close, too close. "Get down," Keller barked, dropping to the floor in a low, fast movement. I didn't need to be told twice. We all dropped to the ground, the dust around us rising in thick clouds. My heart was hammering in my chest as I tried to steady my breath. What was that noise? What was coming? The scraping noise was growing louder, like something moving beneath the building. Something massive, something hungry. I glanced up at Keller, who was staring intently at the radio, his eyes wide with disbelief. He didn't speak, but I could see it in his face, the same realization that had hit me earlier. Whatever had started here, whatever was beneath the earth, was far from over. The outpost, our supposed safe haven, was now just another part of the sinking world. And the creatures, whatever they were not far behind. The scraping noise was closer now, scraping and shifting like something massive dragging itself through the earth. The floor beneath us shuddered violently, sending dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. My ears rang with the vibrations, and the weight of what was happening pressed down on me like a physical force. The silence between each tremor grew louder, more oppressive. Keller kept his hand on the radio, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched. He tried again, twisting the dials, his movements frantic. But the radio only hissed back at him in static. I felt the cold sweat on my forehead. My breath came shallow, quick. There was no time left. The ground was breaking apart around us, and whatever was beneath us was coming for us. The hollow ones, the things that had once been human, had never truly been our main concern. It was what had been feeding on them, what had been waiting in the depths, that terrified me now. "Keller," Jamie whispered, her voice breaking. "What if no one is left?" Keller didn't answer. He was too focused on the radio, desperately trying to find a signal. His fingers moved rapidly over the buttons, his body rigid with tension. The scraping noise grew louder, closer, a sickening sound of something crawling, dragging itself across the earth's skin. The walls creaked, and I swore I could feel the ground opening up beneath me. "We're not safe here," I muttered, my throat dry. "There's nothing here." Keller didn't even look up at me. His eyes remained fixed on the radio, his lips pressed into a thin line. He turned the dial again, and this time there was a crackling voice, a distorted, broken voice, barely audible over the noise. "This is Commander Hastings," the voice said, static cutting in and out. Is anyone there?" Keller's eyes snapped to me. For a split second, I saw something like hope flicker in his gaze. But it was fleeting, replaced almost immediately by the grim reality of the situation. "Commander, this is Sergeant Keller." He spoke into the mic, his voice steady, but I could hear the tremor beneath it. "We need evacuation. We need immediate extraction. The ground, there's something wrong with it. It's alive." The static warped again, the voice barely audible. "Evacuation is not an option," the voice of Commander Hastings rasped. "We've lost control. The ground it's not stable anywhere. The breach." There was a long pause. The words that followed sounded strained, as though the commander was struggling to breathe. "We've lost contact with all other outposts. It's not just this area, Keller. It's everywhere. We've triggered something we don't understand. There's no escape. The radio went silent. Dead air. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. I could hear the scraping again, louder now. The walls groaned in protest, and the floor beneath us trembled as if something massive was stirring beneath it. Keller slammed his fist against the radio, cutting off the static. No, this can't be happening," he muttered under his breath, his voice tight with disbelief. "This isn't real." I could feel the weight of the words in the air. The truth settled in like a stone in my gut. Whatever was happening, whatever had been unleashed, was far beyond anything we could understand. The creatures in the ground, the hollow ones, they were only a symptom of something much bigger, something ancient, and it was devouring everything in its path. I heard the low, groaning sound again, a sound so deep it seemed to come from the very core of the earth. It wasn't the scraping anymore. It was something else, something more terrifying, something closer. "Get up," Keller said suddenly, his voice sharp. He grabbed Jamie's arm, pulling her to her feet. "We need to move. Now." I didn't argue. I stood up, my legs shaking, my mind reeling. But when I looked around the room, it hit me. This was it. There was no escape. Not really. The walls were closing in. The ground beneath us was cracking, collapsing, pulling us toward the darkness below. We were all going to be swallowed one by one. "We can't outrun it," Jamie said, her voice trembling as she looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. "What are we supposed to do? Where can we go?" Keller didn't answer. He was staring at the door, his hand gripping his weapon with white knuckles. The scraping sound had stopped, but the low groaning noise remained, and it felt like the ground itself was about to devour us. "We go to the surface," Keller finally said, his voice low but firm. "We fight. We find any remaining soldiers, and we make a stand." I nodded, though I knew it was futile. We had no way of knowing what awaited us outside. The world had turned into a nightmare, and there was no escape. But the idea of just waiting to die was even worse. We moved toward the door, our steps tentative but determined. As we reached the entrance, a burst of light flickered from above, and the sound of helicopters whirring through the air reached our ears. Finally, I breathed, my heart racing in my chest. But just as quickly as the hope flared, it flickered out. The helicopters were not here to save us. They were here to make sure we never left. The ground beneath us shifted violently, sending us crashing to the floor. The walls cracked, and the ceiling buckled as the very foundation of the building began to collapse. The scraping noise returned, louder now, more frantic, as though something was trying to claw its way up through the earth itself. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the silence. A silence so deep, so absolute, that it swallowed everything. There were no sounds of birds, no wind, just the hollow stillness of a world that had stopped turning. I looked at Keller. His face was pale, his expression blank. He knew what was coming, and so did I. The helicopters were hovering above us, and they weren't here to rescue us. They were here for a much darker purpose. "They've sealed us in," I whispered. "We're trapped." Keller nodded, his eyes meeting mine. There was no hope left in them, no fight, just the acceptance that this was the end. And then, in the distance, I saw it. The ground, the earth itself, rising up, pushing the buildings back, as though it were alive, reclaiming what had once been its own. A black, inky wave that swallowed everything in its path. The last thing I heard before the world went dark was the low groaning sound, closer than ever, and then nothing.